Behind every locked door lies a story the world was never meant to hear. Welcome to Behind Bars TV, where we uncover the hidden realities of the world's toughest prisons, untold inmate experiences, and the systems built to contain them. From supermax facilities to forgotten penitentiaries, we reveal the truth behind concrete walls and razor wire. This is not fiction. This is the world behind bars.
When a prison becomes mind. For nearly a century, America's most dangerous men were locked inside concrete, and the concrete learned how to think. Every wall, every door, every silence became smarter, tighter, colder. What began as punishment became science. From the rock in San Francisco Bay to the fortress in Colorado's desert, this is the story of how America built prisons that no longer just cage the body, but control the mind. From Alcatraz to ADX, the evolution of absolute control. The rock rises. Before it became the most feared prison in America, Alcatraz was a military fortress, built to guard San Francisco Bay. But in 1934, as the Great Depression deepened and gangsters ruled the headlines, the U.S. government decided to turn the fortress into something else. A place no criminal could escape. The Justice Department called it the ultimate deterrent. Newspapers called it the Rock. It was built for men who had defied every other prison: mob bosses, murderers, escape artists. Its first shipment of inmates arrived on August 11, 1934, under heavy guard. Among them were names that struck fear into America. Al Capone, the Chicago mob king. Machine Gun Kelly, the bootlegging legend. Doc Barker, son of the infamous Barker gang. The message was clear. If you came to Alcatraz, you were already broken. This place would finish the job. Life inside the rock. Life on Alcatraz was engineered to erase individuality. Every day was identical, down to the second. 5:30 a.m., wake-up bell. 6 o'clock, breakfast in total silence. 7 o'clock, work detail in the laundry, kitchen, or workshops. 12 o'clock, lunch, silence again. 4:30, count. 9:30, lights out. No conversation without permission. No touching. No privacy, not even in the showers. The guards called it tight discipline. The inmates called it living in a tomb. One former prisoner said, "The worst part wasn't the noise, it was the quiet. The quiet got inside your bones." Even sound was weaponized. Footsteps echoed like clock ticks. The clang of steel became the rhythm of their lives. Every rule, every sound, every silence, designed to remind them that freedom wasn't just gone, it never existed here. The battle for the rock. Despite the fear, Alcatraz's walls couldn't contain desperation forever. Between 1936 and 1962, there were 14 escape attempts, 36 men, and no confirmed successes. But that didn't stop them from trying. The most famous attempt came in May 1946, the Battle of Alcatraz. 6 inmates, led by Bernard Coy, overpowered guards, stole guns, and seized control of a cell block. Their plan failed when they couldn't access the main yard gate. The key had been hidden. For 2 days, gunfire and grenades thundered across the island. When it ended, 2 guards and 3 inmates were dead. The survivors were executed. But the message echoed louder than the bullets. Even the strongest walls can't contain hope or insanity. The birth of psychological control. By the 1950s, America's prisons were changing. Alcatraz had proven that brute force alone wasn't enough. Escape attempts, riots, and violence still erupted, even in unbreakable prisons. So a new idea emerged. If physical barriers couldn't control men, maybe their minds could. The Federal Bureau of Prisons began consulting psychologists to design behavior-based systems of punishment. No more beatings, just isolation. No chaos, just silence. Isolation cells, once rare, became standard. Inmates who disobeyed were locked alone for days, then weeks, then months. Prison reformers called it progress. Inmates called it the whole. This was the first step toward behavioral engineering, the shift from punishment to control. Alcatraz was closed in 1963, declared too expensive and too brutal. But its spirit, its architecture of obedience, lived on. The blueprint for the future. When Alcatraz closed, America needed a new fortress, a new symbol of control. The answer came in Marion, Illinois. Built in 1963, USP Marion was designed to replace Alcatraz as the nation's highest security prison. At first, it allowed movement, education, and limited work programs. But after 2 guards were murdered in 1983, everything changed overnight. The entire prison was locked down. No more open yards. No more contact. No more sound. Marion became the first permanent lockdown prison in U.S. history. A place where every inmate lived 23 hours a day in solitary. What started as emergency policy became permanent architecture. The era of Supermax had begun. The lockdown revolution. Inside these control units, human movement became mathematical. Doors opened by remote switch. Meals delivered through slots. Communication reduced to intercom buzzes. Wardens called it efficiency. Inmates called it erasure. A Marion prisoner described the first years of lockdown in a smuggled letter. They don't just cage you, they delete you. Every sound, every face, every thought that reminds you you're alive, they erase. Isolation turned into infrastructure. Control was no longer reactionary, it was routine. And as Marion proved its success, other states followed. Pelican Bay in California, Florence in Colorado, Red Onion in Virginia, Tams in Illinois. A new kind of facility was born. Not for rehabilitation, not for containment, but for permanent control. The age of riots. As the lockdown model spread, so did resistance. By the late 1980s, U.S. prisons were boiling. Inmates rioted in New Mexico 1980, Lucasville 1993, Attica Echoes Reborn 1991. Each rebellion a desperate response to the same question. How much control is too much? The New Mexico State Penitentiary riot was the turning point. It began over overcrowding and ended in apocalypse. Inmates took over the facility, seized guards, and executed informants. When the National Guard stormed it, 33 were dead, many mutilated. To politicians, it proved their point. Give us more control or chaos wins. To inmates, it was the proof of another truth. You can't cage desperation without breaking the cage itself. Every riot that followed justified building tighter prisons, not better ones. Each tragedy became another reason to remove choice, noise, and light. By the early 1990s, control was no longer a tactic. It was a religion, the science of obedience. A voiceover whispers psychological terms: sensory deprivation, learned helplessness. While politicians sold control as safety, scientists sold it as progress. Psychologists working with the Federal Bureau of Prisons began developing theories to manage behavior through environment. They called it behavioral modification. Cells were redesigned for sensory deprivation. Smooth walls, no windows, limited color, constant artificial light. Food, temperature, and light exposure became tools to train compliance. Every inch of the modern prison was built with one question in mind. How do we make a man obey without ever touching him? They studied what broke people fastest. Silence, solitude, predictable repetition. Wardens called it control. Doctors called it conditioning. It was the same science used in Cold War experiments, only now it had a new name: Supermax psychology. One prison architect famously said in 1992, "We don't need guards with whips. The architecture does the work." The birth of ADX Florence. Construction began in 1991 in Florence, Colorado, an isolated desert town chosen for its remoteness. The project cost over $60 million and opened in 1994. Official name: United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence. Unofficial name: the Alcatraz of the Rockies. The men who designed it called it a clean solution. Every detail served one goal: absolute control without violence. Cells, 7 by 12 feet, made entirely of poured concrete. Beds, concrete slabs. Toilets, stainless steel. Windows, 4 inches wide, angled upward. No horizon, no human sight line. Movement, remote control doors. Sound, muffled through acoustic baffling. Inmates spend 23 to 24 hours a day alone. Meals pass through a slot. Recreation means pacing in a concrete cage the size of a truck bed. It was the purest realization of a century's evolution. From Alcatraz's iron to Marion's isolation to ADX's psychological perfection. The Bureau of Prisons described it as escape-proof, disturbance-proof, and mistake-proof. But inside, prisoners called it something else. A place built to bury your mind alive. The mind within the fortress. Inside ADX, control goes beyond routine. It becomes reality. Every sound, every sight, every human interaction is scripted. Lights dim on schedule. Air vents hum with exact precision. Guards move in timed sequences to prevent eye contact. It's not chaos, it's choreography. Psychologists later said ADX was built as a behavioral experiment disguised as a prison. Its creators designed a feedback loop. Isolation breeds silence. Silence breeds compliance. Compliance justifies isolation. Over time, prisoners report the same symptoms. Hallucinations, panic attacks, obsessive counting, dissociation. Some talk to themselves. Some forget their own names. In 2013, a former inmate described ADX as a mind-eating machine. You don't serve time here, time serves you. One guard, anonymously interviewed by PBS, said, "It's quiet, but it's not peace. It's the sound of people disappearing." ADX wasn't built to punish. It was built to control forever. The perfect evolution of a system that began on Alcatraz's shore. The ghosts of Alcatraz return. By the 1990s, Alcatraz was long abandoned, a museum of failure. But its spirit lived on in Florence, Colorado. Alcatraz's inmates were gangsters, killers, and legends of the underworld. ADX's residents were something darker, the ghosts of modern fear. Here, you'd find names that filled news cycles and nightmares. Fyodor Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Ramzi Youssef, 1993 World Trade Center bomber. Zacarias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker of 9/11. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. Jakar Tsarnaev, Boston Marathon bomber. El Chapo Guzman, the drug lord who broke out everywhere except here. The Bureau of Prisons called it the most secure facility on Earth. But inside, the inmates called it the tomb. Each man existed alone, sealed, monitored, and forgotten. Conversations replaced with echoes. Hope replaced with order. One inmate once said, "You don't die in ADX. You just fade until the walls forget your name." The man who couldn't be controlled, Thomas Silverstein. Before ADX even existed, one man inspired its design. His name was Thomas Silverstein, a leader of the Aryan Brotherhood, and the man once called the most dangerous prisoner in America. In 1983, Silverstein murdered a correctional officer inside Marion Penitentiary during its lockdown phase, stabbing him 40 times with a homemade shank. The government responded by locking him in total isolation for the next 36 years. No human contact, no conversation, no sunlight. His cell was a prototype, a living experiment in absolute sensory control. When ADX opened, its architects studied his conditions to perfect theirs. In a rare interview, Silverstein said, "At first, you fight to stay sane. Then you fight to remember why you're fighting." He drew sketches of his cell from memory, the bed, the bars, the walls, to prove he still existed. When he died in 2019, his obituary called him a killer. But in truth, he'd become something else. The blueprint for the Supermax mind. The Unabomber's silence. Fyodor Kaczynski, a mathematics prodigy turned anti-technology terrorist, was sentenced to life without parole in 1998. He'd lived in a cabin for decades before being captured. Now he lived in another, made of concrete. At ADX, Kaczynski became one of the few who didn't resist isolation. He accepted it. He wrote letters, read philosophy, and refused media contact. To guards, he was quiet, polite, methodical. To psychologists, he was fascinating. A man who rejected modern society, now trapped in the machine he'd tried to destroy. "This is the perfect irony," one journalist wrote. A man who wanted to live alone, given the only solitude America still knows how to build. His letters, later leaked, revealed both defiance and despair. They call it justice. I call it entropy. He died by suicide in 2023. Even in death, he became the symbol of what ADX truly is, a place where control is absolute, but freedom remains undefeated in thought. El Chapo's Golden Cage. When Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, Mexico's most powerful drug lord, was sentenced in 2019, the world asked one question. Can any prison hold him? He'd escaped twice before, once through a laundry cart, once through a mile-long tunnel with rails and ventilation. But ADX was built for men like him. No visitors beyond glass. No phone calls unmonitored. No escape routes. Inmates at ADX are rotated between cells to prevent mapping layouts. Ventilation shafts are too small for a child to crawl through. Even the shower drains lead nowhere. Guards call it the fortress that never sleeps. El Chapo, once commanding armies of soldiers and assassins, now spends 23 hours a day alone, speaking only to lawyers through glass, in English he barely understands. One federal officer told Reuters, "If Alcatraz broke men, ADX erases them." The guards' confession. The guards of ADX call themselves ghost watchers. They're trained not to look too long, not to think too hard, not to listen. They monitor over 400 cameras, every movement timed, every routine repeated. They see men deteriorate silently, day by day, breath by breath. One former officer confessed anonymously. It's like working in a cemetery where everyone's still breathing. Another said, "I used to go home and hear the silence in my dreams." Some guards quit after months. Others adapt, learning to talk less, to care less. Because to survive in ADX, even the staff must be controlled. Psychologists found that many officers suffer from vicarious trauma, absorbing the inmate's isolation. It's a side effect of a system so precise, it punishes everyone inside its walls. "We built a perfect prison," one warden said. "We just forgot to leave the exit for the soul." The breaking point. For years, ADX was seen as unbreakable. But by the early 2010s, the cracks began to show. Dozens of inmates reported the same symptoms: hallucinations, paranoia, self-mutilation, and suicide attempts. The very design meant to control violence was breeding madness. A 2012 Human Rights Watch report called ADX the cleanest form of torture in modern America. Inmates filed grievances describing endless panic attacks. One wrote, "The silence screams. The walls breathe. I hear voices in the vent, sometimes mine." Another said, "You start thinking the light is watching you. You can't close your eyes because the darkness is worse." By 2013, at least 5 inmates had taken their own lives. Others ripped their skin, swallowed metal, or begged for transfer to death row. Because dying seemed faster. Even guards couldn't deny what they saw. One officer admitted off record, "We don't fix behavior here. We just pause it until it breaks." The illusion of control was cracking. The lawsuit that shook the walls. In 2012, a group of ADX inmates filed a groundbreaking federal lawsuit. Baycoat versus Federal Bureau of Prisons. The claim: ADX Florence systematically violated the 8th Amendment, prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment by holding mentally ill prisoners in conditions that guaranteed psychological collapse. The evidence was staggering. Letters, suicide logs, psychological reports, all pointing to the same truth. Men were losing their minds in a place built to contain monsters. Even prison staff confirmed that therapy sessions happened through doors, not in person. Medication was dispensed through slots. One prisoner described treatment as a conversation with a shadow. The lawsuit forced the Bureau of Prisons to quietly settle, a rare event. They agreed to mental health reforms, creating a new program called Control Unit Step Down to slowly reintroduce human contact. But critics say it changed little. ADX still stands, its population still isolated. And the men who sued? Most remain there today, under revised supervision. "You can't reform a tomb," one of them wrote. "You can only decorate it." Exporting the Supermax model. What began in Marion and perfected in Florence spread across the planet. Governments called them control centers. Activists called them architectures of fear. By the 2000s, Supermax-style facilities appeared in Australia's Goulburn Correctional Centre, Brazil's Presidente Venceslau Prison, South Africa's CMAX Pretoria, Britain's Belmarsh and Wakefield, each modeled after ADX, with remote doors, no movement, no contact. Even developing nations received U.S. funding to replicate the design under anti-terror initiatives. Blueprints once stamped Florence prototype, now circled the world. The export wasn't about punishment, it was about control logistics. A way to manage dissent, rebellion, and unrest with minimal risk to authority. The Supermax model is the new frontier of governance. Said one UN investigator, "It's not about criminals, it's about how power treats fear." America had exported more than walls. It exported the philosophy of total compliance.
What you just saw is more than a story. It's a reality lived by thousands behind bars. If you believe in uncovering the truth, the kind hidden behind concrete walls and silence, then join us. Subscribe to Behind Bars TV and never miss a chapter in the world's most dangerous stories. Until next time, stay aware, stay informed, and remember, freedom and confinement are sometimes only a wall apart.